In this video, we'll dive into 4 haunting tales from those who work in the delicate space between life and death. Morticians encounter things most of us only dream or have nightmares about. From unsettling requests from grieving families to chilling encounters with those who haven't quite crossed over, these stories reveal how even the most experienced morticians can find themselves in moments that defy explanation. Settle in and brace yourself for the uncanny tales from the mortuary. Story number 1. I never imagined that working as a translator for the community would put me in such strange situations. One time, I received a call from the morgue, a first for me, even after 4 years on the job. The person on the other end introduced himself as David, a mortician, and said he had a favor to ask. He asked if I had ever seen a dead body before. I replied that I had, since I also work in a hospital. Then David explained he had a particularly difficult case with a Southeast Asian woman that had expired and needed my help translating. What he said next sent chills through me. David asked if we could FaceTime so I could see what he was doing and explain it to the deceased. I thought, oh, what the heck? But it was my job, so I agreed. When we started FaceTiming, I could see David on my screen. He told me he had been a mortician for over 20 years and usually had no problem with stiff bodies. He could simply stretch their arms and legs. But in this case, the deceased was an elderly woman with osteoporosis. He was concerned that forcing her limbs would break her fragile bones. David said he treats the dead with the same respect as if they were still alive, and he didn't want to damage her in any way. At that point, I hadn't yet seen the woman's body because David was blocking her from the camera. He explained that the family had found her passed away in a fetal position. She was already stiff, and they couldn't stretch her out due to her long history of stroke and contracture. They had requested that David dress her in traditional funeral clothing, and he needed me to translate his instructions to the deceased. Translating for the dead? This was definitely strange, but I said I was ready. David stepped aside, revealing the body curled up on the table. David gently grabbed her right arm to show me how stiff it was. Since he was now standing further from his iPad, he spoke a bit louder. He asked me to tell the corpse to straighten out her right arm. I was nervous, but I did as he asked, saying, "Granny, he's asking you to straighten out your right arm." Right then, David was able to straighten her arm with surprising ease. I thought, what the heck? David continued, asking me to guide her to straighten out each limb, and we went through the whole process. To my astonishment, he was able to dress her in her traditional funeral clothing without any issues. Afterward, David came closer to the iPad to talk to me, and I could see the granny's head just behind him. He explained that many experienced morticians speak to the dead as though they can hear and understand. He said that more often than not, treating the deceased with respect actually makes the job easier. And that's why he wanted me to translate, since he couldn't speak our language. After that, David thanked me and we hung up. That was the strangest case I've ever dealt with. Story number 2. I had the body of a middle-aged Asian woman who had died of ovarian cancer. She was only 52, small and thin. She was tiny and easy to prepare. I had everything done and she was dressed in her traditional cultural clothes. But there was one problem. I couldn't get her eyes to stay closed. I had already used 2 sets of oculist eye caps, which help close the eyes and make them look natural. But her eyes kept opening for some reasons. It was a Thursday night and I was preparing the body for her funeral on Friday morning. I went to a nearby gas station and bought superglue. Every once in a while I have a case like this, where superglue is the only option to keep the eyes shut. When I got back, I used the glue and her eyes finally stayed closed. She looked peaceful, almost like she was just sleeping, and I thought her family would be pleased. On Friday morning, just before handing her over to the family, I checked the casket and saw her eyes were still shut. I closed the casket, and we delivered her to the family at their designated funeral site. This group from Southeast Asia have a tradition of taking the body out of the casket and laying it on the floor for certain rituals. When I opened the casket, though, everyone looked shocked. Her eyes were wide open, with the white oculus eye caps visible and some dried glue on 2 of her fingers for some reasons. It didn't look good. I told the family to give me a moment. I put on gloves and carefully removed the eye caps and glue as best I could. I explained to them that I'd had difficulty keeping her eyes closed and asked if I could try one more time. Her husband was present, and he told me it was okay. He said I didn't need to try again. Instead, he sent someone to get their son Lee, who was waiting outside. When Lee came in, they spoke to him in their native language. I didn't understand, but I heard his older sister say to him in English, "What are you so afraid of? She's your mother." I saw Lee say something to his mother in their language. Then he gently placed his palm over his mother's eyes and slowly closed them. This time, they stayed closed. I was curious about what he had done, so I went over to him afterward. I told him I'd had a very hard time closing his mother's eyes and asked what he had said to make it work. Lee explained that 4 years ago he had married a Chinese woman, which his mother didn't approve of. According to his mother, a wife of different race or ethnicity wouldn't work out. Eventually, the wife will leave. His mother told him that if his wife didn't leave him within 2 years, she wouldn't close her eyes in death. Lee said that he reassured his mother that his wife loved him very much and that she had nothing to worry about. After that, he was able to close her eyes. He also mentioned their belief in parental curses and how seriously children take them. The rest of the funeral went smoothly. Story number 3. Many of us with the sixth sense actually ended up with jobs that deal with death. I am a person with the sixth sense, and I am also a mortician. One night at 2 a.m., I was called into work because the body of a young man had been brought in. For our line of work, it's much easier to embalm and prep the body when it's still fresh, which is why morticians work at all hours. This young man had shot himself, the bullet entering through his mouth and exiting the top of his head. He was a soldier who had returned from Afghanistan, suffering from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. He was a straightforward case. I removed his clothes and wiped him down. As I was taking his clothes off, I felt something in the back pocket of his pants. I put his clothes aside, planning to check it later. I dressed him in his military uniform, but for some reason I didn't. His family hadn't included his military hat. I'd have to ask them about it later since I needed the hat to cover the wound on the top of his head. I used a hairnet instead, though it looked a bit odd. Military uniform and all, with a hairnet. When I finished preparing his body, I picked up his pants and pulled out what was in his back pocket. It was a letter. Immediately, I felt a wave of nausea, like I wanted to vomit. I sensed a powerful, vengeful presence in the room with me. I didn't say anything and didn't read the letter. That was personal. I decided I'd pass it along to his family. Then I heard his soul, loud and clear, telling me to take the hairnet off. He was shouting, "Take the hairnet off!" I replied that I wanted to leave it on until his family brought the military hat, but he screamed again, "Take it off now!" So I removed the hairnet and stepped out to my office to drink some coffee and clear my head. I could hear his soul crying as he looked at the top of his head. After about 5 minutes, I returned to the room where I'd been working on his body. The soul was still there. I can sense it. I put the hairnet back on and told him that as soon as his family brought his hat, I'd replace the hairnet with it. After that, I no longer felt his presence in the room. Sometimes spirits need time to realize they're gone and need to move on. I went back to my office and finished my coffee, but my mind kept going back to his letter. I knew I shouldn't open it, as it was likely meant for his family, but my curiosity got the better of me. Why would a young, strong, good-looking man take his own life? I returned to the room and unfolded the letter. This is what it said. My post was in a small desert village. Every night while I was on guard duty, I would hear little boys being violated. Even now that I'm home, I can still hear their screams and cries for help. The end. Story number 4. My wife and I own a mortuary. The mortuary is also our home. We've been in the death business for 17 years and have never had any issues with families or clients. We always strive to make the deceased look like they're peacefully sleeping. Sometimes we can even make them look a few years younger. Most families are pleased with our work. After a long day, my wife and I love to go for drives to unwind. Our favorite thing to do is grab some French fries and sodas and drive around the countryside and forest roads. Since we usually drive late at night, we sometimes see unusual things. For instance, on Road 26, around 1 a.m., we'd occasionally see a construction worker holding a sign that says, "Slow down." Sometimes the sign would read, "Stop." When we see him, he's always alone in the dark. We know that anyone who slows down or stops isn't from the area. People from our small town know not to stop or slow down for that construction worker in the middle of the night. My wife and I remember him well. He was one of the most challenging cases we ever had because he'd been hit by a car 13 years ago. During these drives, we used to chat about work. In the early years, we'd laugh about how the bodies of obese people would cause huge flames and even smell like bacon when cremated. That's one of the reasons we don't eat bacon anymore. These bodies could burn for up to 6 hours and sometimes start uncontrollable grease fires. But we stopped talking about it, especially since my wife gained some weight over the years. Now we mostly discuss people with breast implants and how we have to remove the implants before cremation. Today, I started work at 6 a.m. Even though it was an early start, I wasn't tired. After work, my wife and I went out for another drive, probably our very last ride together. Ever since she discovered I'd cheated on her with our housekeeper, she barely speaks to me anymore. We used to have endless conversations on these drives. But tonight, she didn't say a word. I was the only one talking, while she just stared out the window. As I kept talking, tears started dripping down my face. I asked her to forgive me, but she stayed silent. I regretted everything. She was the woman who supported me through everything, who gave me her all, who made me the man I am today. It was a quiet night with a full moon. We took our usual country road, but when we reached Road 26, we didn't see the construction worker. My wife looked beautiful, sitting there in the passenger seat, looking at least 5 years younger with her long lashes and thick hair. She reminded me of the woman I first fell in love with. When we got home, my son Jack and his wife Amy were waiting in the parking lot. They helped me take my wife inside and lay her down. Afterward, I asked Jack and Amy if they liked bacon. They said they loved bacon. I told them to leave if they loved bacon. After they left, I locked myself in the room with the cremation chamber with my wife on the table. The room smells like bacon for 6 hours, surrounded by pictures of my wife. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.